Welcome back. Let's take you back now to Washington, D.C., where my colleague Xoli Mngambi is standing by, and he, of course, is keeping us updated on the latest on the U.S. elections. Xoli even did a quick check of what the weather looks like in Washington, D.C., because that hopefully speaks to just how much activity we're able to see in that day. Unfortunately, it's going to stay clear for you. Donald Trump has already cast his vote. What's next for Kamala Harris?
Naledi, good evening to you and afternoon my time. You raise a very important issue because whenever there are elections, particularly in South Africa, the weather is an important factor. And I can tell you that it is unusually hot here in Washington, D.C., and we are told that it is fall, and what that means is that it is autumn, and therefore, this time of the year, it's usually cold, and for some strange reason, it's fairly hot, Naledi. In fact, my last crossing to you, I started actually dripping with sweat. Here's the important bit about that, Naledi, because I have been also watching the local channels here, and they are also pointing out that the weather in some states could potentially be one to watch or be a factor as to the voter turnout. But as far as we are hearing, there aren't any major incidents relating to weather conditions. But I can tell you that voting is going full steam ahead. We haven't heard any incidents. But you mentioned Donald Trump, who we are told has voted about a half an hour ago, and that's where I want to go now, to Palm Beach, Florida. William Denselow is our correspondent there. William, good morning to you. My time, well, it's afternoon now. Just tell us a little bit more about when Donald Trump voted, and might he have a viewing sort of thing where it is organized for him. We know Kamala Harris is going to have a viewing party here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As you rightly mentioned, about 30 minutes ago or so, Donald Trump, along with his wife Melania, cast their votes. About 20 minutes or so away from where we are, Donald Trump, along with other people in Palm Beach area's votes will then be tabulated and counted at this station you can see behind me. Donald Trump also gave somewhat of an impromptu press conference after casting his ballot. He was asked how optimistic he was feeling, with, of course, the poll showing how incredibly tight this race is. Donald Trump, speaking to reporters, claims that he and his team are doing well everywhere. He says that his team is very confident. He says that in some states it's not even close. Now, of course, a huge question in the minds of many Americans, still very pressing in their minds, is what transpired 4 years ago. Donald Trump's claims of election interference, a lack of integrity in the voting system, undermining the political process, claims from Donald Trump and his team of vote rigging, voter fraud. That, in the minds of Donald Trump's opponents, directly led to what transpired on January 6th, the storming of the US Capitol. That was posed to Donald Trump again at this press conference, whether he will accept the result of these elections if he loses. He says if he deems them to be fair, then he'll be the first to acknowledge his defeat. But of course, the key point in there, if he deems them to be fair. He was quizzed on that. He says that so far he thinks they are fair, but in recent days he has been complaining about the election system here in the US. And also on that issue of violence, he says he condemns it. He says that his supporters do not engage in violent acts.
Very interesting comments indeed, William Denselow. Thank you very much for the time being. So that's the lay of the land, Naledi, as voting progresses. It is midday here in Washington, D.C., and we are going to be watching this election very closely because particularly after the polling stations close. The tradition here is that the voting stations, much like in South Africa, they are allowed to post the result. That's the result in a particular voting station. But remember, it is unofficial. But what the broadcasters do here, or even some news agencies, is that they start collating that information with a view to call particular states. And in particular, you will know that it is 7 states that are watched, and those are key swing states. And so any of the candidates that takes any of the most watched states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and it is also Georgia. Those are some of the key states that we are told they are watched very closely. And so any result that comes from those states, it is that time then that broadcasters or news agencies start calling the elections. And so that's why these viewing parties, if you will, are organized for the candidates.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, Xoli. And then, of course, you look at just where the polling has been sitting. And depending, in fact, on who you ask, you're getting different results from polls. So The Guardian at the moment in the US running with the Democratic candidate having an 8% lead among those who have already cast their votes in those early ballots, while Donald Trump is, according to polls, ahead for those they say that they are yet to vote. And just 30 minutes ago, as you mentioned, we did see Donald Trump casting his vote, Xoli, and one of the things that he's talked about is his concern around, you talk about Pennsylvania, his concern that it may take long to get the result from Pennsylvania, a worry for him, and of course that brings about whether or not we might see the former president raising allegations of electoral fraud. But let's talk a little bit about how big of an election this is. I mean, for a South African audience, we have to sort of imagine the fact that more people than our own population had already voted in those early ballots, but over 330 million Americans, that being the population. So that's a lot of counting that needs to take place in very many states.
Indeed, Naledi, in fact, the point you are raising is a critical one because, yes, America is a country of 350 million people. So far, we are told that in comparison to other elections, in terms of the early vote that has been cast, it does stand out to be possibly the biggest. And then you're going to add to it the people that are going to be voting today, and those numbers are likely to be higher. So it'll be interesting to watch what the voter turnout is. And once you then have that, importantly, it is how many people, therefore, have voted, and could these swing states be the ones that ultimately result in this election going one way or the other. But the sentiment, Naledi, is that the people are not going to call this election as quickly as we may want them to, based on previous elections, tradition dictating that the elections would possibly be called a day after the election. However, today or in 2024, this election is going to be just too close to call. And so the understanding is that the officials are going to be very careful with announcing the final result. And so the suggestion is that it may take a few days before we make any conclusive result about who has won this election.
Yeah, you talk about the swing states, and I think that obviously as that counting, and you talk about how that's going to take some time, a lot of people are going to be keeping a close eye on those swing states. And one of them, an interesting case, and that being Michigan. Xoli, particularly for Kamala Harris, where, she obviously has been trying to campaign, also having touched ground in Michigan before heading towards Washington, D.C. today. But it's an important state, particularly because of the large Muslim community and Arab American community in that state. And they'd be watching in the run-up to this election very closely around the utterances that she makes on foreign policy, especially where the Middle East is concerned.
In the last few days of campaigning, Kamala Harris actually did touch on Gaza, and that is something that got everyone talking again, because this is a subject that she has been trying to avoid. Remember, it is the Biden-Harris administration, and therefore Donald Trump doing his best to marry what the Harris campaign is saying on the ground to what the Biden administration has been doing. And he has been very clever at that. And this is why, Naledi, and I'm glad you mentioned Michigan, this is why it is feared by her camp that the sentiment around how America has handled the Middle East conflict is possibly something that is going to cost her in this particular vote, because America has been arming Israel. America has been saying unflinchingly that it stands with Israel. Israel has a right to defend itself. But as you mentioned, the Arab American community here, very upset by that. And that particular vote, there's a worry that it could possibly swing to Trump.
Yeah, there's so many moving parts and lots to talk about. And of course, we're going to be touching on all the elements of this election with Xoli Mngambi speaking to us live there from Washington, D.C., bringing us a blow-by-blow coverage of that all-important U.S. election. We've got Ziyanda Ngobo, who's also in swing state, Georgia. She is, in fact, in Atlanta, and we'll be checking with her as well.